Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we try to take some really dense, sometimes pretty abstract ideas from political philosophy and, well, make them make sense. Give you the shortcut.
Yeah, get you right to the core of what matters.
Exactly. And today, we're cracking open a big one. A theory that's shaped how we talk about economic justice for, what, decades now? It's built on deserts, auctions, and an awful lot of clamshells.
You got it. We are diving deep into the work of Ronald Dworkin. His theory of equality is just, well, foundational.
But we've got a specific angle today, right? Because Dworkin himself, he mostly focused his main theory, equality of resources, or EOR, on the domestic state.
That's right. He quite explicitly ducked the issue. That's his phrase of global justice. So our mission, you could say, is to constructively interpret his theory.
Okay, constructively interpret, meaning?
Meaning, we look at the core logic, the machinery of his ideas, and see why many people argue it must extend globally, even if he didn't spell it out. And then, what would that actually look like? What would globalizing Dworkin really demand?
That sounds huge. Okay, let's unpack it. We're dealing with a lot of dense stuff here. But at the absolute heart of Dworkin's philosophy, there's this one core principle, right? Very abstract.
The egalitarian principle. Basically, that every single citizen has a fundamental right to be treated with equal concern and respect by their government. That's the starting point, the philosophical plateau, he calls it.
And he makes this massive claim that pretty much every major political theory since Kant, libertarianism, liberalism, socialism, whatever, they're all just different interpretations of that single right.
Exactly. The big debates in politics aren't really about whether we owe people equal concern. They're about what that actually means in practice. What does equal concern require when we're moving resources around, setting up laws, that kind of thing.
And to make that abstract idea concrete, Dworkin comes up with this amazing, maybe slightly weird toolkit of thought experiments. These are famous.
Oh, yeah. The desert island auction, the envy test, hypothetical insurance. They sound kind of like board games, but they're serious philosophical tools.
They're like the engineering specs for a just society, in his view. So we absolutely have to get a handle on these before we can even think about taking them global.
Definitely. And crucial to understanding all this is his method, constructive interpretation. We need to nail this down because it frames everything we're doing today.
Okay, so it's not just describing things.
No, it's not about, say, finding the original intent of a law or a practice. It's about imposing a purpose on it. Asking, what's the best moral point or principle this practice could serve? How can we make it the best possible example of its form?
So we're not just reporting on justice, we're actively shaping the concept, making it the most coherent, most morally appealing version it can be.
Precisely. It means taking a stand. It leads to substantive political views, not some kind of neutral description. So when we talk about globalizing Dworkin, we're asking, what purpose should we impose on global interactions to make them the best possible instance of equal concern and respect?
That sets a really high bar.
Okay.
So where do we start? Dworkin first had to clear the ground, right? Argue against the theory that came before his.
Yeah, he had to take on equality of welfare, or EOW. So Dworkin lays out two basic ways you could think about equality. Equality of welfare says, basically, move resources around until everyone's equally happy or their preferences are equally fulfilled, their well-being is level.
Okay, that sounds intuitive enough, maybe.
Maybe at first glance. But then there's Dworkin's alternative, equality of resources, EOR, that says, no, equalize the resources people have to pursue their goals, give everyone a fair starting point, an equal set of opportunities, and then let them bear the costs of their own choices.
And Dworkin argues EOW just falls apart pretty quickly because it can't handle choices and responsibility. Which brings us to that famous example, Louis.
Ah, yes. Louis and his expensive tastes, classic Dworkin. So imagine Louis. He deliberately cultivates really expensive tastes. Maybe he decides he can only be truly happy drinking super rare vintage wines or collecting, I don't know, obscure Fabergé eggs.
Okay, a high-maintenance guy.
Right. Now compare him to Jane. Jane's perfectly happy reading library books and drinking tap water. Her tastes are cheap. Under EOW, if welfare means preference satisfaction, Louis is going to score much lower than Jane because his expensive tastes are harder to satisfy.
So if Louis has lower welfare, EOW says the state has to step in, give him more resources.
Exactly. It has to transfer resources from Jane and others with cheaper tastes to Louis until their welfare levels are equal.
And that just feels wrong. Intuitively unfair. Why should Jane subsidize Louis's choice to, like, ridiculously expensive things?
Precisely. It clashes with our sense that people should be responsible for the costs of their choices. But if the state doesn't compensate Louis, then it violates the core principle of EOW, which is equal welfare. So EOW is trapped. It fails that basic fairness test regarding responsibility.
Okay, that's the gut level objection. But you said Dworkin digs deeper. He has this more philosophical killer argument, radical criticism, the fatal circle.
Yes, this is fundamental. He argues EOW isn't just practically difficult, it's theoretically impossible to use as a foundational principle because it gets caught in a loop.
Yeah.
It presupposes the very thing it's trying to establish.
How does that work? Walk me through the circle.
Okay, step one. EOW says measure everyone's welfare, then equalize it. But how do you measure welfare? It's subjective, right?
Yeah.
It's tied to people's goals, ambitions, what they think is possible or fair for them.
Right. What you want depends partly on what you think you can get.
Exactly. Step two, people form those goals and expectations based on their circumstances. If you've always been poor or faced discrimination, you might adapt your expectations downwards. You learn to be satisfied with less because that's all you think you can reasonably hope for.
So your measure of welfare satisfaction is already shaped by potential injustice.
Precisely. Step three, if we then try to measure your welfare, that measurement is already contaminated, you might say, by the unfair background conditions that shaped your expectations in the first place. EOW might look at someone ground down by poverty who says they're reasonably happy and conclude, great, no need to transfer resources here.
But that happiness is based on accepting an unjust situation.
Exactly. It's an illegitimate satisfaction. So, to measure welfare fairly for EOW, you'd first need to correct for the unfair distribution of resources that warped the person's expectations. But correcting the resource distribution is what EOW is supposed to do.
Ah, okay. You need EOW to figure out the fair distribution, but you need the fair distribution to properly measure welfare for EOW. That's the fatal circle.
You got it. It's self-defeating. It shows you can't use welfare as your foundational measure of justice. You need something else. Which leads Dworkin to ground his theory elsewhere.
In that distinction between what we're responsible for and what just happens to us, luck versus choice.
Right.
The core ethical idea behind EOR, the choice-luck distinction, or sometimes framed as personality circumstance. Dworkin thinks this comes directly from our own everyday ethical thinking, our first personal ethical experience.
That feeling that some things are me, my decisions, my values, and other things are just the cards I was dealt.
That's the heart of it. We identify with our personality, our tastes, ambitions, character, our beliefs about what makes life good. These define our ends, our goals, and we generally accept consequential responsibility for pursuing those ends. If my ambition is to climb mountains and I get injured, well, the costs are largely mine to bear.
Because you chose the risky ambition.
Right, but then there are circumstances, our natural talents, physical abilities, maybe our family's wealth, the society we're born into. These are our means. We didn't choose these. And we feel, morally, that we shouldn't be held responsible for disadvantages stemming from pure bad luck in our circumstances. Brute luck, he calls it. So the state's job, under EOR, is to try and neutralize the effects of bad circumstance, bad brute luck, while making sure we remain responsible for our choices and their consequences, what he calls option luck.
Exactly. The distribution has to be ambition-sensitive, reflecting choices, but endowment-insensitive, correcting for brute luck in talents, health, etc.
But that line can get blurry, can't it? Especially with tastes. Is Louis' expensive taste a choice, personality, or some kind of deep-seated psychological thing he can't help, circumstance?
A great question. And Dworkin has another thought experiment for that, the pill test.
Ah, the imaginary pill. Okay, how does this work?
It's designed to sort out different kinds of expensive preferences. Let's take someone who absolutely loves opera. It costs a fortune. Now imagine there's a harmless free pill that would completely remove this desire for opera, make them perfectly happy listening to the radio instead. If the person says, yes, give me the pill. This opera craving is a burden, an addiction. I wish I didn't have it. Then Dworkin says that preference is like a handicap. It's bad preference luck. It's a kind of internal circumstance, potentially compensable, like a disability.
Because they don't identify with it. They wish it away. They'd rather live the cheaper life.
Exactly. But if they refuse the pill, if they say, no way, my love for opera is part of who I am, it reflects my belief in beauty, I wouldn't give it up, then the preference is part of their chosen ends, their personality.
So the high cost isn't bad luck in the preference itself.
Right. It's bad price luck.
Huh.
The cost comes from external factors, how many other people want tickets, how much singers cost, etc. Since they affirm the preference as part of their life plan, they have to take responsibility for the costs associated with it. That cost is part of the fair background against which they make their choices. It's not compensable under EOR.
That's really clever. It uses this weird hypothetical pill to zero in on whether the person owns the preference, morally speaking. The compensation decision hinges entirely on that affirmation or rejection.
It forces a kind of ethical clarity about our desires, and making people bear the consequences of bad price luck for the choices they affirm is absolutely central for Dworkin to respecting their personal responsibility. This is EOR getting calibrated.
Okay, so EOW is out. Dworkin built his alternative, equality of resources, EOR.
Okay.
And you said it has those twin requirements. Let's recap.
Right. EOR demands a distribution of resources, wealth, opportunities that is, 1, ambition sensitive. It should reflect the choices people make about work, risk, consumption.
And 2.
Endowment insensitive. It should not reflect differences in people's innate talents, health, or other factors of brute luck they didn't choose.
So how do you actually achieve that, especially the initial setup? How do you divide up the world's stuff fairly in the first place? This brings us to the island.
The desert island auction, yes. Imagine shipwreck survivors wash up on an island full of resources. Land, timber, minerals, whatever.
Okay, paradise, maybe.
Potentially. But how to divide it up equally? Dworkin's answer. Give everyone an equal amount of purchasing power. Let's use his term, clamshells. Equal starting funds.
Clamshells, got it.
Then, an auctioneer representing the principle of justice or the state divides all the island's impersonal resources, stuff not talents, into bundles or lots. People then bid on these lots using their clamshells based on what fits their life plans, their ambitions.
And the auction runs until...
Until the market clears, all lots are sold. And crucially, the envy test is satisfied.
The envy test, what's that define as?
The distribution is declared truly equal if and only if, when the auction dust settles, no survivor looks at anyone else's total bundle of resources, the land they bought, the materials, plus any clamshells they have left over, and wishes they had that person's bundle instead of their own.
So no envy means it's fair. If even one person is envious, the auction failed.
Exactly. It has to be rerun or prices adjusted until envy is eliminated. Because envy signals that, from the envious person's perspective, the distribution didn't achieve genuine equality of resources for them.
I see the genius there. It forces the price of a resource to reflect its opportunity cost to others. If I want that prime beachfront property for my fishing business, I have to bid high enough to compensate those who wanted it for farming or just relaxing. The price reflects what society gives up for my ambition.
Precisely. It ties individual ambition directly to social cost. But there's a really important subtlety here that often gets overlooked. The auction depends on the authenticity of people's preferences.
Meaning, what if people bid based on messed up ideas?
Exactly. What if, say, due to past sexism, women on the island have been taught they only deserve a tiny plot for gardening, even if they secretly dream of running a huge farm? Their bids might be low, they might not feel envy for the big plots won by men, but their preferences are malformed by injustice. The envy test is formally satisfied, but intuitively it's still unfair.
So the auction needs people bidding with, like, a clear head.
Yeah.
Based on their real goals.
Yes. Dworkin acknowledged this. He said the community or the auctioneer might need to reserve some resources before the auction even starts for what he called pre-auction preparation.
Like what? Therapy? Education?
Could be. Education, information, maybe counseling to help people overcome internalized depression or misinformation so they can form authentic preferences and bid accordingly. This shows EOR isn't some pure free market fantasy. It actually requires significant intervention before the market mechanism can work justly.
Okay, so the auction handles the impersonal stuff, the land, the clamshells. But that leaves the biggest inequality driver, our personal resources, our talents, our health, our innate abilities. How does EOR make the distribution endowment insensitive? Neutralize the luck of the genetic lottery.
This is where the hypothetical insurance device comes in. It's probably the most ingenious and also maybe the most controversial part of the whole theory. The goal is to convert brute luck, the random hand you were dealt in terms of talents or disabilities, into option luck, the result of a calculated risk you chose to take.
How on earth do you do that? It sounds impossible.
It's entirely counterfactual, a thought experiment. We go back to the survivors, before the auction, before they know what talents or disabilities they'll have on this island. They're behind a kind of veil of ignorance about their personal endowments.
Okay, ex ante. before they know their fate.
Right. And in that moment of perfect equality of ignorance, they're offered insurance policies. They can use some of their initial equal share of clamshells to buy insurance against bad luck, like insurance against being born blind or lacking the specific talents needed to earn a good living in this new island economy.
So everyone, not knowing if they'll be lucky or unlucky, has an incentive to buy some insurance against the really bad outcomes.
That's the key assumption. People would rationally trade some of their initial purchasing power for security against catastrophe. They'd buy insurance against ending up unable to pursue any meaningful life plan due to bad brute luck.
And how does this hypothetical insurance market translate to the real world? We don't actually do this.
The outcome of this hypothetical market dictates real-world policy. Specifically, the average level of coverage that people hypothetically would have purchased in that original position that determines the just level of social support and redistribution in the real world.
The average coverage. Okay, explain that.
So if the calculation suggests the average survivor, starting equal, would have spent, say, 15% of their clamshells insuring against severe disability, then a just real-world state is justified in taxing everyone at a level sufficient to fund disability benefits equivalent to that average policy payout. Those taxes are seen as the premiums everyone would have agreed to pay hypothetically.
So things like progressive taxation, disability benefits, unemployment support, these are justified as implementing the results of that hypothetical insurance market.
Exactly. Redistribution isn't charity. It's fulfilling a hypothetical insurance contract that fairness requires.
But wait, using the average coverage, that immediately flags attention for me. Dworkin's all about individual choice and responsibility, but here he's averaging everyone's hypothetical choices together. What if I would have been really risk-averse and bought way more insurance than the average person?
That is the major criticism, the charge that this averaging ignores the separateness of persons. If my individual hypothetical choice was to buy maximum coverage, but society only compensates me based on the lower average choice, doesn't that disrespect my individual, albeit hypothetical, decision? Why am I suddenly being treated as just part of an aggregate?
Yeah, it seems like a crack in his individualist foundation. He seems quite anti-utilitarian, usually focusing on rights, but this feels a bit like sacrificing the individual for the average good. Why does he do it?
It's a really powerful critique. Dworkin has a defense, though. He essentially argues it's a necessary compromise to make the theory workable and still achieve the best possible interpretation of equal concern.
How so?
Two main points. First, practicality. Trying to figure out exactly what insurance policy each specific individual would have bought is epistemologically impossible. We can't read minds, especially hypothetical ones, and trying to fund potentially infinite levels of uniquely tailored compensation based on those unknowable choices would bankrupt any society. It would destroy the very resources EOR aims to distribute fairly.
Okay, so it's just unworkable at the individual level.
That's part one. Part two is that choosing the average is itself arguably an expression of equal concern for all members of the community. It ensures everyone contributes to a robust safety net, reflecting a collective judgment about reasonable protection against misfortune. It balances the need to mitigate bad luck with the need to keep the economy functional and maintain resources for everyone's ambitions. It's the best feasible way to uphold the duty of equal concern overall, even if it's imperfect for the highly risk-averse individual.
So it's a second best solution, justified because the first best, perfect individual compensation, is impossible and self-defeating.
That seems to be the logic. The tension definitely remains, but he argues it's the most coherent and practical interpretation available. Okay, so now we have the domestic EOR machine, the auction for resources, the insurance for endowments. But as we said at the start, Dworkin originally put a boundary around this. He assumed these demanding requirements applied only within a political community.
Right, his bounded view. He felt that this high standard of equal concern and respect was, quote, the special and indispensable virtue of sovereigns, owed only to fellow citizens.
Yes. He argued that for a state to owe this level of justice, it needed to be more than just a coercive power. It had to be a true political community, and he laid out criteria for that.
What were those criteria again? There were 4 virtues.
That's right. Legitimacy, the state had to avoid tyranny, guarantee basic rights, essentially show some minimal level of concern. Democracy, citizens needed equal rights to participate in political decisions. Integrity, the laws needed to be consistent and principled, and the crucial one for boundaries. Fraternity.
Fraternity. That sounds like the key. The U.S. versus them.
Exactly. Fraternity. for Dworkin, means the members share a kind of diffuse special bond, a sense of shared fate, where they accept special, demanding responsibilities towards each other, like paying high taxes for redistribution or serving in the military that they don't owe to outsiders. It's this shared associative tie that, in his original view, justifies the demanding requirements of EOR only being applied internally.
So no global government, no real global fraternity, therefore no global EOR. Maybe basic human rights for outsiders, but not this intent economic equality.
That was the initial implication. But this is where the cosmopolitan thinkers really push back. They ask, hang on, your whole theory is built on this deep, universal moral idea of human dignity, equal moral worth, the distinction between choice and circumstance. Why should the moral significance of that suddenly stop at a border which is just a historical accident?
Yeah, why is the brute luck of where you're born treated differently from the brute luck of what talents you're born with? Morally, they seem the same kind of arbitrary factor.
That's the core challenge. The source material argues strongly against Dworkin's boundary. They propose a different trigger for justice claims, not shared government or fraternity, but something else.
Which is
The pervasive impact trigger.
pervasive impact. Okay, what does that mean? How does that trigger justice?
The argument is pretty straightforward. If the actions, policies, or even the inactions of one group, say, wealthy nations or powerful corporations, have a profound and pervasive impact on the fundamental life chances of people elsewhere, their ability to live, to be healthy, to pursue a life, then that impact itself is enough to trigger duties of justice.
Even without a shared government. Even without feeling like brothers.
Yes. Think about global trade rules set by the WTO, or climate change policies or lack thereof, or intellectual property laws for essential medicines decided in rich countries. These decisions fundamentally shape the circumstances, the opportunities, the brute luck of billions of people who had no say in them.
So those decisions become sites of justice. They have to be justified according to principles of equality. You can't just say, oh, that's foreign affairs, charity maybe, but not justice.
Exactly. The impact creates the moral relationship that demands justification. This leads directly to the idea of an unbounded abstract right. If the ultimate basis is equal moral worth, human dignity, well, that applies to all humans, everywhere. It's hard to argue that equal concern applies fully when it comes to, say, freedom from torture, a liberty issue, but only weakly or not at all when it comes to having the basic resources needed to live a decent life, a distribution issue.
So the universality of the core principle pushes outwards. The burden of proof shifts to those who want a limited scope at the border.
Precisely. If everyone has equal moral worth, then shouldn't the ideal distribution of the world's resources be one that aims to pass a global envy test, compensating for the brute luck of being born in Haiti versus being born in Switzerland?
This really reframes global inequality. It's not just bad luck or misfortune. It's potential injustice. And the sources mention this has implications even within borders, right? Like how we treat undocumented immigrants.
Yes, that's a powerful example. Undocumented immigrants living within a country often aren't considered part of the fraternal community. They lack voting rights, but they are subject to the state's laws, its coercion, and their lives are definitely pervasively impacted by its economic policies and resource distribution.
So if impact triggers justice, the state owes them equal concern too. Not necessarily citizenship, but a basic level of fairness and respect stemming from their sheer humanity and presence.
That's the argument. Treating them vastly differently solely based on birthplace becomes a form of morally arbitrary discrimination that a consistent Dworkinian should reject. If justice follows impact, the neat boundary of the nation-state starts to look ethically porous, maybe even irrelevant for fundamental distributive questions.
Okay, so if we accept the argument that the principles should apply globally, what does that look like? We need a global version of EOR.
Right. The sources construct this as interpretive global luck egalitarianism, or IGLE. It's basically taking Dworkin's domestic EOR framework and applying his method of constructive interpretation to the entire globe.
So what's the core principle of IGLE?
It says that global rules, global institutions, international practices, even individual actions with global reach are at their best, meaning most just when they aim to mitigate the effects of global brute luck while still upholding individual responsibility.
And what counts as global brute luck? What are we trying to mitigate?
Things like being born into a desperately resource-poor country or region, facing endemic diseases that are preventable elsewhere, suffering the consequences of bad climate or geography you didn't choose, having your life prospects wrecked by civil war, or being trapped under a truly awful predatory government you can't escape. These are disadvantages largely outside individual control. IGLE says global structures should try to compensate for them.
How does this compare to other ideas about global justice? Like John Rawls.
It's significantly different and much more demanding. Rawls, in his later work, talked about a duty of assistance between peoples. But that duty was aimed at helping what he called burdened societies reach a threshold where they could manage their own affairs and become well-ordered. Once they reached that threshold, the duty of assistance ended, even if massive inequalities remained between rich and poor societies.
So Rawls focused on getting states to a basic level of functionality.
Right. IGLE, following Dworkin, is focused on the individual. It aims to mitigate brute luck inequalities between individuals across the globe, regardless of whether their state is well-ordered or not. If you live in a stable country, but it suffers from, say, an unavoidable lack of natural resources or crucial development skills, that's still bad brute luck from an individual perspective, and IGLE suggests a continued global obligation to address it. It's about equalizing individual opportunity sets, not just propping up states.
Okay, more demanding. Now let's try the thought experiment. The global auction. The sources use this mini-Earth scenario.
Yeah, imagine humanity has to flee Earth aliens, maybe, and we all land on a new, resource-rich planet, mini-Earth. How do we divide its resources fairly among everyone, applying EOR principles globally?
This sounds like the desert island writ large. But surely new problems arise when you scale it up.
Absolutely. The biggest immediate problem is the cultural diversity problem. Dworkin's auction kind of assumes a background liberal, market-oriented culture where things are valued based on individual utility and willingness to pay. That doesn't map neatly onto the whole world.
This is David Miller's objection, right? That using market value globally isn't neutral. It favors certain ways of life.
Exactly. Miller's example is potent. Imagine two pieces of land on mini-Earth. One is perfect for growing grapes for wine, highly valuable in a market economy. The other is perhaps equally fertile but held sacred by a religious community that forbids alcohol and believes the land must only be used for subsistence farming according to ancient traditions. If the global auction just uses market price, the vineyard land gets a super high clamshell value. The community wanting the sacred land for traditional use has to pay an enormous opportunity cost based on the foregone market profits from wine. This seems to impose a liberal commercial valuation on a culture that rejects it. It feels culturally biased.
So the global envy test, run on purely market terms, might end up penalizing non-market cultures. That doesn't sound like equal respect. How do you fix that?
The proposed solution is quite ingenious. It says the lots in the global auction shouldn't just be raw resources like land. They should be bundles of permits and control rights over those resources. The auctioneer has to be smarter.
Permits and control rights. How does that work with the wine example?
Okay, for that piece of land, the global auctioneer might create two different types of lots you could bid on. Lot A offers liberal use rights. You buy this, you can grow grapes, make wine, build a winery, sell it globally, whatever the market allows. Lot B offers restrictive use rights. You buy this, you get control, but you are bound only to use the land for, say, traditional non-alcoholic farming or religious purposes, respecting the specified cultural constraints.
So groups bid on the kind of control they want, consistent with their values.
Precisely. The religious community bids on Lot B. The aspiring wine entrepreneur bids on Lot A. Now, Lot B will likely cost fewer clamshells than Lot A because it allows less economically profitable activity, but it won't be free. The price of Lot B will reflect the social opportunity cost imposed on everyone else by not allowing the land to be used for its most profitable market purpose.
So the religious group still pays something for their choice to restrict the land use, but the price is set by what others are willing to pay for the alternative use, not by imposing a market value on their use.
Exactly. It achieves a deeper kind of neutrality. The liberal framework isn't dictating the value of the religious practice. It's pricing the consequences of that practice for others in terms of foregone opportunities. The choice to live according to a specific cultural or religious norm is treated as an ambition, part of personality, and its cost is internalized, satisfying the envy test without imposing alien values.
That seems like a plausible way to handle cultural pluralism within the auction model. Okay, back to mini-Earth. We have the resources divided into these clever lots. We have the global population of survivors. The auctioneer needs to distribute the initial purchasing power, the clamshells. Who gets them? This is the auctioneer's quandary.
Yes, big question. Do you give an equal share of clamshells to national representatives? Method 1, say, the ambassador from France gets the clamshells for all French citizens. Or do you give an equal share directly to every single individual survivor on mini-Earth? Method 2.
Method 1 seems simpler, maybe, easier to manage.
Maybe superficially, but it's deeply problematic for Irrigley. The sources argue strongly for Method 2, the individual allocation.
Why? What's wrong with giving clamshells to national reps?
Two huge problems. First, corruption and inequality within nations. The national representative might use the clamshells to buy resources that benefit themselves or the ruling elite, not the average citizen they supposedly represent. The internal distribution could be massively unfair.
Okay, that's obvious. What's the second problem?
Even if the representative is perfectly benevolent and democratic, they're still bidding based on some aggregate or average preference of their nation, or maybe based on strategic national goals. This might not reflect the actual desires of many individuals within that nation.
So an individual farmer in France might look at the bundle of resources secured by the representative for, say, Germany and think, man, that's what I needed for my life plan. My rep got it wrong. The envy test fails at the individual level.
Exactly. Even if the French rep isn't envious of the German rep's national bundle, individual French citizens might well be envious of individual German citizens' resulting resource access. IGLE, as a luck egalitarian theory, must prioritize the individual as the ultimate unit of moral concern.
So giving every single person on the planet an equal starting share of clamshells is the only way to truly honor that individual focus.
Yes. It ensures the starting gate is genuinely equal for all individuals, reflecting Dworkin's second principle of human dignity, personal responsibility, coupled with equal initial bidding power. People can then choose to pool their clamshells, form cooperatives, bid collectively if they want, but the fundamental entitlement rests with the individual. That preserves the ambition-sensitive core of EOR globally.
And the practical upshot of all this elaborate theory of the global auction, the individual clamshells, is that it gives us a benchmark, a standard to judge whether current global arrangements are just.
Precisely. It provides a theoretical baseline for evaluating everything from the exploitation of natural resources to the fairness of international trade and the justification for global redistribution. So, yeah, this global equality of resources, GER, model gives us a powerful lens. We can look at the global trade in oil, minerals, timber, even fishing rights, and ask, is this just? Are the vast revenues flowing from, say, oil reserves in one country fair, given that the location of that oil was pure brute luck? Should some portion of that value have notionally been part of a global auction pool?
It directly confronts the resource curse, doesn't it? That weird phenomena where countries with tons of natural wealth, like oil or diamonds, often end up poorer, more corrupt or more conflict-ridden than countries with very few resources but maybe better institutions or skills.
Exactly. GER helps us dissect that. The resource curse often involves a nasty mix of brute luck factors. There's the good brute luck of having the resource in the ground. But then there's often the bad brute luck of lacking the domestic skills, the stable institutions, the development talent needed to manage that wealth effectively and benefit the whole population. Think Venezuela versus, say, Norway with its oil fund, or Botswana with its diamonds.
So it's not just about the stuff, it's about the capacity to use the stuff well.
Yeah.
How does the global EOR model handle that mix?
Through the insurance mechanism applied globally. Back on Mini-Earth, behind that veil of ignorance, people wouldn't just insure against being born on resource-poor land. They'd also insure against being born into a society that lacks the capacity, the human capital, the governance structures to thrive, even if it has resources.
So global redistribution, justified by the hypothetical insurance, needs to compensate not just for lack of physical resources, but also for lack of these crucial endowments like good governance capacity or widespread technical skills.
That's the implication. Compensation has to address both resource inequality and endowment inequality on a global scale.
Can we see this kind of thinking in any real-world proposals?
Well, the sources suggest things like carbon quotas could be designed using this logic. There's already a global agreement, more or less, that the atmosphere's capacity to absorb carbon is a limited global resource, and access to it needs to be equalized or managed fairly.
Right, the idea of emissions caps.
So you can imagine a system where initial carbon emission permits are distributed equally to every individual on Earth, like clamshells. Then a global market, a kind of auction, allows individuals, companies, or countries to buy and sell these permits. This aligns with GER because it starts from a principle of equal shares of a global resource and uses a market to handle the allocation efficiently. It shows the auction idea works best when you have some prior political agreement on the standard of equality being applied.
Okay, that makes sense for future design. But what about dealing with the massive global brute luck inequalities that exist right now? How does GER reinterpret something like foreign aid?
This is a major application. Historically, foreign aid, whether it's official development assistance, ODA, from governments or humanitarian aid from NGOs, has been framed in different ways. Sometimes as charity, sometimes national self-interest, sometimes post-colonial guilt, sometimes pure compassion.
A mix of motives, often unreliable.
Right. But IGLE demands we apply constructive interpretation to aid itself. Ask, what's the best moral purpose aid could serve? What makes aid the best version of itself? The Dworkinian answer is clear. Aid is at its best when it's understood not as optional charity, but as a mandatory obligation of justice.
Moving aid from the realm of giving to the realm of owing, from generosity to entitlement.
Exactly. It becomes a duty to transfer resources. Why? Because arguably those resources are not rightfully ours in the first place. Maybe they derive from historical exploitation, or from benefiting from global systems that disadvantage others, or simply from the brute luck of being born in a wealthy country. And we owe them to people whose disadvantages are not rightfully theirs, disadvantages stemming from global brute luck like poverty, disease, or disaster.
So the whole history of aid debates the 0.7% GNI target, the shifts between big projects and basic needs. Dworkin would reinterpret all that.
He'd see it as an often fumbling, inconsistent attempt by the world to meet a genuine underlying obligation of justice. The task then becomes, how do we institutionalize this duty properly, make it reliable and fair, instead of leaving it to the whims of donors?
And the proposal for that is this Global Insurance Fund, GF. How would that work? How does it mimic the hypothetical insurance globally?
The GIF would be the concrete mechanism. Instead of ad hoc appeals after earthquakes or famines, nations, especially wealthy ones, and perhaps even corporations benefiting from global resources would be mandated to contribute to this fund. Contributions might be calculated based on their wealth, their resource endowments, maybe even their historical contribution to problems like climate change.
So it's like a global tax funding and insurance pool.
Essentially, yes. And this fund would then pay out to individuals or communities suffering from specified forms of bad global brute luck. The resource curse we talked about, major natural disasters, pandemics, perhaps even compensation for lacking critical development infrastructure due to historical factors. The key is, when disaster strikes, affected people aren't begging for charity. They're making a claim against the GIF, an entitlement based on the insurance they hypothetically would have purchased.
That really does shift the dynamic from recipient to rights holder.
Absolutely. But there's a complication. Remember the cultural diversity issue with the auction? It pops up again with insurance, specifically the Muslim objection to commercial insurance.
Right, because standard insurance involves trading risk and uncertainty, which can be seen as a form of gambling, I share, or charging interest, riba, both prohibited in many interpretations of Islamic law.
Exactly. So if this global insurance fund was set up purely on a Western commercial insurance model, it would effectively force Muslim individuals and communities, a huge part of the world, to violate their religious principles just to access the compensation they're owed as a matter of justice. That fails the equal respect part of equal concern and respect.
So you can't just impose one model. How does GER handle this?
The Dworkinian solution has to be pluralistic. The GIF framework needs to accommodate alternative, culturally acceptable models of risk sharing. The prime example here is takaful, or Islamic insurance.
Takaful. How does that work differently?
Takaful literally means mutual guarantee. It's not a contract where you pay a premium to a company that profits from managing risk. It's more like a cooperative or mutual fund. Members pool contributions, donations effectively, into a shared fund managed on their behalf, often on a nonprofit basis. If a member suffers a covered loss, they receive compensation from that collective pool. It's based on solidarity and mutual assistance, not commercial risk transfer.
So it avoids the problematic elements of gambling or interest.
Generally, yes, according to Islamic finance scholars. So the proposed GIF would need to be flexible. It could operate perhaps on a twin-track system, allowing standard insurance mechanisms alongside takaful compliance structures. Maybe it supports or integrates with local bottom-up takaful cooperatives. The goal is to ensure everyone can access their entitlement to compensation in a way that respects their deeply held ethical or religious convictions.
So equal concern requires providing the safety net, and equal respect requires providing it in culturally appropriate ways. It maintains a Dworkinian focus on individual responsibility within different rule systems.
Precisely. Failing to do so would be a kind of liberal imperialism, assuming secular market rules trump religious law, which undermines the whole project of finding a truly global, legitimate form of justice.
Okay, we built this impressive global structure. But there's one massive elephant still in the room: nationalism. Most people feel stronger obligations to their own compatriots. How does this demanding global egalitarianism square with patriotism and the welfare state that relies on national solidarity?
That's arguably the biggest political hurdle. Many people accept we owe something to foreigners, basic human rights, maybe some humanitarian aid, but they insist we have special, weightier duties to fellow citizens. That the trust needed for a high-tax, high-redistribution welfare state only exists within national borders built on shared identity.
So how does the global Dworkinian respond? Do they just say nationalism is bad?
Not necessarily. The cosmopolitan argument, drawing from these ideas, doesn't usually deny that special relationships create special obligations. The argument is about the priority and nature of those obligations.
Okay, what's the compromise position?
It's often called weak cosmopolitanism. It argues you can consistently believe two things. First, that we do have special associative obligations to people we share a community with, like co-nationals. Maybe we owe them extra effort in building complex social goods like healthcare systems that require deep trust.
Okay, special duties exist.
But these special duties towards insiders cannot erase or diminish our general duties of justice towards everyone globally. Particularly, the negative duties don't harm, and the basic positive duties derive from equal concern, like the duty to compensate for disadvantages stemming from brute luck via something like the GIF.
So special national ties might justify doing more for compatriots in some areas, but they don't justify doing less than what basic global justice demands for outsiders.
That's the idea. It prevents the simple, rigid ordering that says, my country always comes first, which can lead to morally awful outcomes like spending lavishly on a minor domestic issue while ignoring catastrophic but preventable suffering abroad. Weak cosmopolitanism tries to find a balance, respect national ties, but insists they operate within constraints set by universal duties of justice grounded in equal concern for all human beings.
Okay, that feels like a possible way to reconcile the two, though the exact line is obviously going to be fiercely debated. Hashtag tag tag outro. Wow. Okay, this has been, well, a real deep dive. We've journeyed through Ronald Dworkin's incredibly rigorous, sometimes mind-bending theory of domestic equality, all those concepts: equal concern, ambition sensitivity, endowment insensitivity.
The envy tests, the auction, the hypothetical insurance, it's a complex machine.
Definitely. And then we took that machine, applied constructive interpretation, and explored how its core logic can be, many argue, must be extended to the global stage, building this idea of global equality of resources.
Yeah, an interpretive global luck egalitarianism, one that aims to neutralize global brute luck resource curses, disasters, disease, lack of development capacity through mechanisms like a global auction of control rights and a global insurance fund operating as an entitlement, not charity, and doing so while trying to respect cultural diversity.
I think the biggest takeaway for me, and maybe for you listening, is that fundamental shift in perspective. Global inequality isn't just about bad luck that we might choose to alleviate through charity. If you buy this argument, it's potentially about injustice. It's about ensuring everyone on the planet has a genuinely fair starting point, ex ante equality, so they can take responsibility for their own lives against a backdrop of fair shares and protection from catastrophe.
It really changes the moral landscape.
Yeah.
And it leaves us, as always, with a final challenging thought to chew on.
Oh, yeah.
If we accept that pervasive impact triggers justice claims, and if GER gives us a plausible, rigorous model for what global justice requires, then how much national prioritization is actually justifiable? Where exactly do our special obligations to compatriots end, and our general duties of global equal concern take absolute priority? Can we find a stable balance, or is the logic of equal concern ultimately radically cosmopolitan, demanding far more global redistribution than any nation currently contemplates?
That's the boundary Dworkin might have sidestepped, but one we definitely need to keep wrestling with. A perfect place to leave it for this deep dive.